The Sterling Crown Ballroom looked the way Atlanta looked on its best nights. Like it had always belonged to itself, and had simply been waiting for the right person to prove it. Crystal chandeliers threw warm light across marble floors that had been restored to a finish so clean you could see the room reflected back at you from below. The air carried the scent of fresh flowers and something older underneath. Wood and polish and the particular weight of a building that had lived through several versions of itself before arriving at this one. Guests moved through the space with the unhurried ease of people who knew they were exactly where they were supposed to be. Jayden Carter stood near the far edge of the main hall, holding a glass of water he hadn't touched. He was 26 years old, dressed in a dark suit that fit him the way well-made things fit when you've stopped thinking about what they cost. Naturally, without effort. His face was calm. His eyes moved slowly across the room, not restlessly, just the way eyes move when they belong to someone who learned a long time ago to read a space before committing to it. Between the fingers of his left hand, he held a small silver compass. He wasn't looking at it. He rarely looked at it directly anymore. It had become the kind of thing his hand simply found during moments that carried weight, the way other people reach for a phone or a watch without thinking, except that what he was reaching for had nothing to do with time and everything to do with direction. The Sterling Crown Ballroom was his. Not in the way people say something is theirs when they feel attached to it, or when it holds memories they return to. His, legally, on paper, in the quiet, permanent way that ownership works when it has been built through years of decisions that nobody outside a very small circle had paid close attention to. He had purchased it 11 months ago, and had spent those 11 months restoring it, carefully without rushing the process or overcorrecting it, and tonight was the reopening. Atlanta's professional community had turned out in the way it turned out for things that carried both history and momentum, and the room had filled steadily over the past hour with exactly the kind of energy he had been building toward. He should have felt satisfied. He did feel satisfied. But underneath that, something else was present. Something that had been sitting quietly since the moment the guest list was finalized and he had made a decision he still wasn't entirely sure about. Savannah Jones was in this room tonight. He had put her name on the list himself. Not out of sentiment. Not out of strategy. He had done it because leaving her name off would itself have been a decision, an act of exclusion, and he didn't want the Sterling Crown's next chapter to begin that way. Not this building. Not after everything it meant. But knowing why he had done it didn't make the evening feel simple. Across the ballroom, near the entrance, a woman in a deep navy dress paused just inside the doors and let her eyes move across the room with the practiced ease of someone who had been reading spaces like this one her entire life. Jayden noticed her the moment she cleared the entrance. He didn't move. He simply held the compass a little tighter than he had a moment before and waited to see what the night was going to ask of him. Before we go any further, I want you to know that I spent a long time with this story, because stories like this one deserve to be told the right way. If you're someone who appreciates narratives about resilience, dignity, and the quiet kind of justice that takes years to arrive, consider subscribing and staying with us for the ones still to come. And tell me this, what would you do if someone who hurt you years ago suddenly walked back into your life? Jayden Carter grew up on the south side of Atlanta in a 2-bedroom apartment on Delmar Street, where the hallway lights flickered every time someone ran the microwave and the landlord answered maintenance requests on his own schedule, which was to say almost never. It wasn't a hard life in the way that gets described in broad strokes. There was food most nights. There was warmth in winter. There was a mother who showed up to every school event she could make it to, still in her work uniform when the shift ran long, sitting in the back row so she could leave quietly if a call came in. Linda Carter was not a woman who asked for acknowledgement. She simply kept moving, and Jayden grew up watching that movement and absorbing what it meant before anyone sat him down to explain it. Linda worked catering jobs across Atlanta. She had been doing it since before Jayden was born, moving from venue to venue, from event to event, carrying trays and setting tables and breaking down rooms at the end of long nights while the guests who had filled those rooms were already home and asleep. She was reliable and precise, and she understood that the invisible work, the work that happened in kitchens and service corridors before anyone arrived and after everyone left, was what made the visible work possible. She brought Jayden with her sometimes, when the alternative was leaving him alone in an apartment in a part of Atlanta that had already taken too much from too many people she knew. He was 9 the first time he came along. A corporate dinner at a hotel downtown, the kind of event where everyone wore name badges and spoke in the clipped language of people who billed their time by the quarter hour. Linda set him up in a corner of the service corridor with a plate of food and a book, and told him to stay close and stay quiet. He stayed close and stayed quiet, but he also watched. He watched through the small window in the corridor door, the way guests moved through the room without checking whether they were welcome, the way they assumed access before anyone confirmed it. He watched the staff around them adjust and accommodate and disappear back into the service areas between moments, as though they existed only in the gaps. He noticed things he didn't have language for yet. He noticed that some people walked into rooms and the room responded immediately. Space was made, attention shifted, conversations paused and redirected. And he noticed that other people walked into the same rooms and were assessed before they were addressed, evaluated before they were acknowledged, treated as questions that needed answering rather than presences that were simply welcome. He noticed which category his mother moved in. He noticed which category the people she was serving moved in. He didn't feel anger at 9 years old. He wasn't old enough to have built the framework for it. What he felt was closer to a large, wordless question that settled somewhere in the middle of his chest and didn't leave when he went back to his book, or when Linda drove them home after midnight with the radio on low. The question stayed with him. It would stay for years, growing more specific and more urgent as he grew old enough to give it edges. Savannah Jones turned 16 on a Saturday in October, and in the Jones household, a 16th birthday was not simply a birthday. It was a presentation, the kind that required months of planning, a carefully selected guest list, imported flowers, a hired photographer, and a venue that communicated, without anyone needing to say it directly, that the Jones family occupied a particular position in Atlanta's social world. The Sterling Crown Ballroom was booked for the evening. Linda Carter had been assigned to the catering team through the company she had worked with for 5 years. She arrived 2 hours before the guests, the way she always arrived. Early, focused, carrying the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that her job was to make the evening feel effortless for people who would never think about what went into it. Jayden was 14, old enough to be genuinely useful, carrying equipment, clearing plates, staying out of the way with a competence his mother had spent years quietly building in him. He knew the routine. He knew where he was supposed to be and where he wasn't. He was supposed to stay in the kitchen corridor. For most of the evening, he did exactly that. He sat on a stool near the prep station, eating the food Linda had set aside for him, listening to the muffled sound of the party on the other side of the wall, music, laughter, the particular energy of a room full of teenagers celebrating something that felt, from where he was sitting, like an entirely different world. Then a server pushed open the kitchen door to carry out a tray, and Jayden caught a glimpse of the ballroom floor. The light was different from anything he had seen through those corridor windows before. The chandeliers were turned up fully, throwing warm gold across the room, and the decorations, white and rose gold, professional and expensive, transformed the space into something that barely resembled the functional venue his mother worked in on ordinary evenings. Girls in formal dresses and boys in blazers moved through it with the specific ease of people who had grown up being comfortable in rooms exactly like this one. He told himself he was just going to look. He pushed the door open a few inches further, just enough to see more clearly, and somehow, in the way these things happen when you are 14 and curiosity is stronger than caution, he ended up a few steps inside the room. He wasn't sure exactly when his feet had crossed the threshold, but they had. He stood there for no more than 30 seconds. Jeans and a plain shirt, no name badge, holding nothing, belonging to nothing visible in that space. The room moved around him without noticing him for a moment, and there was something briefly disorienting about that, about being invisible even when you were standing in the middle of a lit room full of people. Then the invisibility ended. Savannah Jones was standing with a group of friends near the center of the room when her eyes found him. She was 16, poised, wearing something white that had clearly been chosen carefully for this exact evening, and her expression when she registered his presence didn't shift into curiosity or confusion. It shifted into something faster than both, a kind of immediate social certainty, the instinct of someone who had grown up in rooms like this one and had developed, without ever being formally taught it, a precise sense of who belonged in them and who didn't. She excused herself from her friends without hurry. She walked toward him with the calm of someone who had already decided how the situation was going to end before she had taken the first step. She stopped in front of him, looked at him with an expression that communicated the situation completely before she opened her mouth, and then told him, quietly, directly, without raising her voice, that this was a private event and he needed to leave. A member of the event staff appeared within seconds, as though the system for handling exactly this kind of moment was already in place and had simply been waiting to be activated. Jayden was walked back through the service door. No argument from anyone. No scene. No raised voices. The staff member who escorted him didn't make eye contact, and Jayden didn't ask him to. The music didn't pause. The conversations didn't stop. The party resumed instantly, without a ripple, as though the interruption had been so minor it barely registered as having happened. Because for everyone in that room except one 14-year-old boy being guided back through a door, nothing had. That was what he carried home. Not the walk itself. Not the words Savannah had used, which were few and not theatrical in their tone, just certain in a way that was its own kind of cutting. Not even the look on her face, which he would think about more than once in the years that followed. What he carried home was the silence afterward. The way the room simply continued. The way his absence registered as nothing, not even as a correction, just as a return to the way things were supposed to be. He was 14 years old, and he understood, in the specific way you understand things that bypass your reasoning and land somewhere deeper, that the world did not notice when it pushed certain people out of certain rooms. And that understanding, quiet and heavy as it was, would become the most important thing that ever happened to him. Linda didn't find out what had happened until they were on the bus home. The event had ended, the kitchen had been broken down and cleaned, the other staff had said their goodnights, and Linda had collected Jayden from the corridor where she had left him. Quieter than usual, she noticed, but teenage boys went quiet sometimes, and she had learned not to push until he was ready. He told her on the bus. He kept it simple and factual, the way he had learned to deliver difficult things, where he had gone, what had happened, how it had ended. He looked straight ahead at the seat in front of him the entire time he talked, and Linda listened without saying a word, her hands folded in her lap, her face doing the particular thing it did when she was processing something she needed to be careful with before she responded. Outside the window, Atlanta moved past them in the dark. Lit storefronts, people on corners, the city doing what it always did regardless of what was happening to any single person inside it. Linda was quiet for long enough that the silence became its own kind of answer. Then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. It was her supervisor from the catering company, calling at 11:40 on a Saturday night, which was not a normal thing, and which meant that what Jayden had just told her had already traveled through a different channel before she had even had a chance to process it herself. She answered. The call lasted 3 minutes. When she hung up, she put the phone carefully back in her bag and looked out the window, and Jayden watched her profile in the dim light of the bus and understood, without being told, that the call had not contained good news. Linda had been removed from the Sterling Crown Ballroom's preferred vendor list. The catering company hadn't let her go. They were careful about the way they worded things. But the Sterling Crown was their most reliable source of large event contracts, and being removed from that rotation meant her hours would drop significantly. It meant the rhythm of their life, which Linda had built carefully around what she earned, was going to have to be rebuilt around something smaller. She didn't explain any of that to him on the bus. But over the following weeks, Jayden watched the details arrive anyway. The extra shifts at a diner, 2 bus rides from their apartment, the lights left off in rooms they weren't using, the grocery trips that became more deliberate and less flexible. Linda started going to bed later and getting up earlier, as though she was trying to manufacture more hours of effort inside the same amount of time. He watched all of it without saying anything, because there was nothing useful to say. But he felt it, the full, specific weight of understanding that his 30 seconds of curiosity had cost his mother something real. Not an embarrassment, not an awkward story she would tell later. Something with a number attached to it, something that showed up in the gap between what used to be in the refrigerator and what was in it now. That understanding settled into him alongside the memory of the party itself, and the two things together became something he carried quietly, without drama, for a very long time. Do you think people ever realize how much damage a single act of disrespect can cause? Tell us in the comments, because the answer to that question matters a great deal before this story is finished. 3 weeks after the party, on a Sunday morning when the apartment was quiet and Linda was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she had been nursing for an hour, Jayden sat down across from her and asked her something he had been carrying since the night of the bus ride home. He asked her why she hadn't been angrier. Not at him. He understood that she had every right to be angry at him, and he had been waiting for that anger to arrive in full, and it hadn't, which confused him in its own way. But at the situation, at the people who had made the phone call, at Savannah Jones and her party and the room that had simply continued without missing a beat after he was walked out of it. Linda looked at him for a long moment. Then she wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and said that anger was not something she could afford to carry at full weight, because she had too many other things to carry and anger was heavy, and it didn't put anything back that had been taken from you. She said that what had happened was not fair. And she said it plainly, without softening it or wrapping it in anything, because she had always believed that telling him the truth was more respectful than protecting him from it. But she also said that the world did not always organize itself around fairness, and that there were two ways to respond to that. You could spend your energy being furious at the way the world was organized, which was a real and understandable response, or you could spend that same energy building something inside it that the world couldn't easily move or dismiss or walk back through a door. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Then she said, "Baby, you can't always control which rooms let you in, but you can become the person who builds them." Jayden didn't fully understand what that meant at 14, but he remembered it. He remembered it the way you remember things that arrive before you have the capacity to act on them, not as instruction exactly, but as direction. Something that waits patiently inside you until the moment arrives when you finally have the tools to do something with it. He kept it with him, quiet and without ceremony, for the years that followed. The years between 14 and 22 were not dramatic ones for Jayden Carter, which is to say they were exactly the kind of years that build the people who eventually do dramatic things. He went to school and did well, not effortlessly but consistently, which is a different and more honest thing. He studied in the library after school because the apartment on Delmar Street was small and Linda's evening shifts meant the television was often on for company, and he had learned early that concentration was something you had to build a container for rather than waiting for it to show up on its own. He got his first job at 15, weekend shifts at a grocery store 3 blocks from home, bagging and stocking and doing the invisible work that kept the place functioning between the moments when customers were paying attention to it. He gave half of what he earned to Linda without being asked, and she took it without making it a conversation, because they had developed over the years a language of practical love that didn't require a lot of words to function. He worked a second job at 17 and a third at 19. None of them were impressive, and Jayden didn't pretend otherwise. But he paid attention inside all of them, the same way he had paid attention in those catering corridors at 9 years old, watching how things were organized, how decisions got made, how the people at the top of each small system had arrived there, and what they understood that the people around them hadn't yet worked out. He kept a notebook. Not a journal. Jayden was not a journal person. It was a plain black notebook, the kind you could buy in bulk from any drugstore, and he used it to write down patterns he was noticing. The store manager who arrived an hour before opening always knew about problems before they became visible to anyone else. The colleague who asked one specific question in every meeting always left with more information than everyone around him. The vendor who delivered consistently, without needing to be reminded, always got better treatment than the vendor who delivered better product unpredictably. Small observations, practical ones. The kind that don't look like much individually but accumulate into something over time. He filled 2 notebooks before he graduated high school. He got into Georgia State on a partial scholarship, enough to make it possible with what he had saved and what Linda contributed, not enough to make it comfortable, which was fine because comfort had never been the condition he was building toward. He studied finance and urban planning, a combination that most of his academic advisors found unusual and that made complete sense to him. He wanted to understand how money moved through cities, why it went where it went, why some neighborhoods in Atlanta had new construction on every block while other neighborhoods 3 miles away had buildings that had been declining quietly for 20 years, and why the people making those decisions were never the people living in either place. He kept working through university. He kept filling the notebooks. And in the second semester of his sophomore year, he walked into an elective on urban economics taught by a professor named Raymond Ellis, sat down in the 3rd row, opened a fresh notebook to the first page, and started paying attention in the particular way he paid attention when something told him that what was about to happen was going to matter. What's one lesson from your childhood that still guides your decisions today? Tell us in the comments, because the lesson Jayden was about to receive changed the entire direction of everything that came after it. Professor Raymond Ellis was not the kind of teacher who made learning feel warm. He was 58 years old, with close-cropped gray hair and the specific impatience of someone who had spent decades watching intelligent people waste their own potential. He didn't perform enthusiasm. He didn't soften difficult material or repeat himself for students who hadn't done the reading. He walked into his first session 11 minutes late, set his bag down without acknowledging the delay, looked at the room for a moment that lasted slightly longer than comfortable, and then began speaking at a pace that assumed everyone present was already keeping up. Half the class dropped within the first 2 weeks. Jayden stayed. Not because he found it easy, not at first, but because Ellis didn't teach economics as a set of theories to memorize. He taught it as a living system to be understood. A deeply human, deeply political system that explained why Atlanta looked the way it looked, worked the way it worked, and had its winners and losers distributed the way they were. By the 4th week, Jayden was staying after sessions to continue conversations that the timetable cut short. By the 8th week, those conversations had moved to Ellis's office, and the content had shifted from course material into something harder to categorize, the kind of thinking that sits at the intersection of patience, observation, and long-term decision-making. Ellis asked questions more than he answered them. Pointed, specific questions that forced Jayden to take things he had observed and felt and suspected, and actually articulate them clearly enough to be examined. It was during one of those office conversations, on a Tuesday afternoon in November, that Ellis reached into the top drawer of his desk and placed a small silver compass on the table between them. He didn't make an occasion of it. He simply said, "Direction matters more than speed," and pushed it across the desk. Jayden picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. The casing was worn the way objects get worn when they have been handled regularly over many years. Not damaged, just used, carrying the texture of something that had been part of a life. The needle settled north immediately, without hesitation. He looked up at Ellis, waiting for more. Ellis had already opened a different folder and moved on. Jayden understood, sitting there in that office with a compass in his hand, that the rest of the explanation wasn't coming, because it wasn't needed. The compass wasn't a lesson to be decoded in one sitting. It was something to be carried, and the meaning of it would arrive in pieces, through years, through the moments when he reached for it and felt its weight and remembered that direction was something you had to keep choosing, not something that chose you once and stayed fixed on its own. He put it in his jacket pocket that afternoon. It didn't leave his person for the next 4 years. Nobody builds anything real quickly, regardless of what the story looks like from the outside. Jayden took a position with a property management company on Atlanta's west side the year he graduated. Not because it was prestigious, but because it put him inside a system he needed to understand from the ground level before he could think clearly about anything above it. He managed maintenance schedules, handled tenant communications, processed lease renewals. Work that most people with his academic record would have considered beneath what their degree entitled them to. Jayden considered it a paid education. He learned how buildings actually functioned when nobody important was paying attention to them. He learned how deferred maintenance compounded quietly into structural problems that cost 3 times as much to correct as they would have if caught earlier. He learned that tenant relationships built on basic consistency and genuine respect produce stability that no marketing strategy could replicate. He also learned something less technical and more valuable. He learned how decisions got made before they were announced, which Atlanta properties were being quietly assessed for acquisition, which neighborhoods were showing up in planning conversations that hadn't yet produced any public documentation, which investors were repositioning money in directions that hadn't yet appeared in any headline or market report. He didn't act on any of it immediately. He recorded it in the notebook, clean and factual, building a picture of how the city's commercial real estate market actually operated underneath how it presented itself. After 2 years, he left the management company and took a position assisting a developer named Marcus Webb. Webb had a reputation in Atlanta's commercial property world for being exacting, direct, and almost consistently right about where value was moving before the broader market caught up to it. He had built his portfolio over 15 years through rigorous analysis and the specific kind of patience that most people in the industry talked about but rarely practiced. He interviewed Jayden twice. In the second interview, during a conversation about an underperforming retail property on the east side, Jayden asked 3 consecutive questions that Webb said most people with 10 years of experience wouldn't have thought to ask. He offered him the position before the meeting ended. Jayden started the following Monday, compass in his left jacket pocket and a fresh notebook under his arm, and he spent the next 3 years learning, from one of the sharpest people in the city, how value moved before recognition did, and what it looked like to build something that lasted because it was built on understanding rather than momentum. The Sterling Crown Ballroom appeared on Jayden's desk on a Wednesday afternoon in March, inside a 10-page acquisition summary that a contact had sent over with a short note attached. Motivated seller, clean title, priced below potential, available for quiet negotiation. Jayden read it the way he read everything, without rushing, making small marks in the margin where questions formed or numbers didn't align with what the surrounding context suggested they should. He was 4 pages in when he reached the property history section. The Sterling Crown Ballroom had been built in 1991. It had operated continuously as an event venue through 3 ownership changes, hosting galas, charity fundraisers, corporate dinners, wedding receptions, and private celebrations across more than 3 decades of Atlanta social life. He kept reading. And there, in a summary paragraph about the venue's notable private events, was a reference to a Sweet 16 birthday celebration hosted by one of Atlanta's prominent families. October. The Jones family. Jayden set the document down. He sat back in his chair and looked at the wall for a moment. Not dramatically, just the way a person looks at a neutral surface when something needs a moment to settle before they continue. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and took out the compass. He held it without looking at it, the needle finding north the way it always did. Steadily, without effort, pointing in the same direction it had always pointed regardless of where he happened to be standing when he needed it. He thought about his mother on the bus home that night. He thought about the phone call she received at 11:40. He thought about the grocery trips that became more deliberate in the weeks that followed, and the lights left off in rooms they weren't using, and Linda getting up earlier and going to bed later as though effort itself was a form of protection against a world that had just reminded her how easily it could take something away. He thought about what she had said at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning. You can't always control which rooms let you in, but you can become the person who builds them. He sat with all of that for long enough that the afternoon light in his office shifted toward early evening. Then he picked the document back up and continued reading from where he had left off, because whatever this moment was, it didn't change his process. Property was either a sound acquisition or it wasn't. His history with a building didn't alter its structural condition or its market position. He ran the numbers over the following week with the same discipline he applied to everything else. And the numbers were clear. The Sterling Crown Ballroom was undervalued, structurally sound beneath its neglected surface, and positioned in a part of Atlanta that his analysis suggested was moving in a direction the broader market hadn't yet priced in. It was a good acquisition. He made an offer the following Monday. The renovation took 11 months. Jayden didn't rush it and he didn't overcorrect it. The instinct with a venue that carries history is to either preserve it so carefully it becomes a museum, or modernize it so completely that whatever made it worth saving disappears in the process. He had watched both mistakes made by people with more resources than patience, and he had no interest in repeating either of them. He kept the marble floors. He restored the original chandeliers rather than replacing them. He redesigned the service areas, the staff corridors, the kitchen access points, the break rooms, with the same level of attention he gave the main hall, because he had spent enough of his childhood on the other side of those walls to understand that a venue was only ever as good as how it treated the people who made it function. That particular decision drew comment from a few people who reviewed the renovation plans. Jayden didn't explain it at length. He simply said that the building should work well for everyone inside it and moved on. The guest list for the reopening was intentional, a mix of Atlanta's established professional community and people who were building things that hadn't yet become established, because Jayden had a specific idea about what the Sterling Crown should stand for going forward, and it required both. Savannah Jones received an invitation. He had thought carefully before putting her name on the list. He wasn't interested in staging a confrontation, and he wasn't interested in manufacturing a moment. But leaving her name off would itself have been a decision, a quiet act of exclusion, and he didn't want the Sterling Crown's next chapter to begin that way. Not this building. Not after everything it represented. So her name went on the list. She arrived at 8 in the evening, in a deep navy dress, moving through the entrance with the composed ease of someone who had spent her entire life being comfortable in rooms like this one. She spent the first hour doing what she always did at events like this. Moving through introductions, reading the room, collecting information while appearing simply to enjoy herself. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. She noticed Jayden near the far wall early in the evening. A man standing completely still in a room full of people working hard to appear effortless. Something about him registered and didn't resolve the way a familiar song registers before you can place the title. She was crossing to the far side of the room for a drink when she passed close enough to see what he was holding in his left hand. The compass stopped her before her mind had finished forming the thought. It wasn't the compass itself that she recognized, not as a specific object she had seen before, but something about it reached past the rational part of her mind and landed somewhere else entirely, the way certain things do when they carry weight that belongs to a moment rather than to themselves. She stood still for just a second too long, and in that second the man turned slightly, the same slight turn she had noticed earlier across the room, and their eyes met properly for the first time. Close enough now that the distance which had softened it before was no longer available. She knew him, not from Atlanta's professional circles, not from any recent context she could reach for deliberately, from a Saturday in October, from a sweet 16 birthday party at this exact building, in this exact room 12 years ago. From a 14-year-old boy in jeans and a plain shirt standing on a ballroom floor that she had, without hesitation, without much thought at all, decided he had no business standing on. The recognition arrived with a weight she wasn't prepared for. Not shame exactly, though shame was part of it. Something more complete than shame. The specific discomfort of understanding, clearly and without any available defense, that something you did when you were young enough to think it was simple had turned out to be far more complicated than it appeared in the moment you did it. She didn't look away. Neither did he. He held her gaze without expression. Not coldly, not warmly. Just steadily, the way someone looks at you when they have had a long time to arrive at how they feel about something and have reached a place that doesn't require performance. After a moment that lasted longer than the room around them knew, he inclined his head slightly, small, unhurried, and spoke to her for the first time. "It's a good room," he said simply. "I'm glad you came." They moved to a quieter corner of the ballroom without discussing it. A mutual, unspoken agreement that the conversation they were about to have deserved a little distance from the rest of the room. Savannah spoke first. She said that she remembered that night. She didn't soften it or frame it with context about how young she had been. She had spent enough of her adult life watching people construct careful justifications for things they had done when they were certain and unaware, and she had always found it more exhausting than honest. She said she remembered that she had thought about it more than once over the years, and that she was sorry, not in a general way but specifically for the ease with which she had done it, and for the ease with which the room had simply let her. Jayden listened without interrupting. He didn't tell her it was fine, because it hadn't been fine. But he also didn't need her to carry the weight of it any further than she already was. He had built too much in too deliberate and patient a way to still be waiting on a moment from when he was 14 years old to release him from anything. What he told her was the truth. He told her the night had stayed with him, not as bitterness, but as direction. That he had spent years learning how rooms like this one were built, who got to decide who stood in them, and what it would take to become someone who had a different kind of answer to those questions. He told her about his mother on the bus, and what Linda had said at the kitchen table 3 weeks later, and how those words had become something he returned to every time the work got hard enough that returning to something was necessary. He told her about Professor Ellis, the compass, the office in November, the drawer, and she listened the way people listen when they understand they are being trusted with something real. Then he held the compass up briefly, not for effect, just as a simple illustration of what he was describing, and closed his hand around it again. Savannah looked at him for a long moment. Then she asked what he planned to do with the Sterling Crown going forward. He said he wanted it to be a room that didn't decide, before you walked through the door, whether you were the kind of person who was allowed to stand inside it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she thought that was worth building. The Sterling Crown Ballroom ran its first full season under Jayden's ownership that spring and into the summer, and it filled consistently, not because of the renovation alone, though the renovation was exceptional, but because word moved through Atlanta the way it moves when a space earns a reputation for being run with genuine intention. Jayden had made one operational decision early on that people noticed without always being able to articulate why. Every event hosted at the Sterling Crown, regardless of its size or budget, was required to meet the same standard of treatment for its working staff. Not just on paper, genuinely. The service corridors were clean and well lit. The break rooms had real food in them. The catering teams had access to the same building amenities as the guests they were serving. It was a small shift in operational terms, and it cost money, and Jayden didn't apologize for either of those facts to anyone who questioned them. Linda Carter came to the ballroom for the first time that summer. Jayden hadn't told her much about the property when he acquired it. He had told her it was a sound acquisition in a part of Atlanta he believed in, which was true and complete enough. He brought her on a Sunday afternoon when the ballroom was empty, just the two of them walking through a space that held more history between them than either needed to narrate out loud. She stood in the center of the main hall and looked up at the restored chandeliers for a long moment. Then she looked at her son. She didn't reach for anything dramatic. Linda Carter had never been a woman who reached for drama when the truth was already sufficient. She simply looked at Jayden, standing in the middle of a room he owned, and nodded once. The kind of nod that contains everything that doesn't need to be spoken aloud between two people who have been through something together and both know exactly what it cost. Jayden reached into his jacket pocket. He took out the compass, held it for a moment, the needle settling north the way it always had, patient and unchanged by anything the years had thrown at it. And then he walked upstairs to his office, opened the top drawer of his desk, and took out the small glass case he had ordered 3 weeks earlier. He set it on the shelf above his desk, where the afternoon light caught it clearly, and placed the compass inside. Not as a trophy, not as a monument to anything he had overcome, just as something that had made the journey with him and deserved to rest somewhere it wouldn't get lost. The Sterling Crown continued filling with Atlanta's stories through that year and the ones that followed, graduations and anniversaries, charity fundraisers, the kinds of celebrations that mark the moments people carry long after the evening ends. It became the kind of venue where the people working the event were treated with the same basic dignity as the people attending it, which turned out to be worth more in reputation than any amount of renovation or marketing ever could be. Savannah Jones returned to the ballroom twice that year. Each time, she and Jayden exchanged the kind of greeting that belongs to people who have said the necessary things and arrived at something quieter and more durable on the other side of them. They didn't become close friends, that wasn't the shape the story took. But they became something, two people who had been connected by a single moment a long time ago and had each, in their own way, been shaped by it, and who now occupied the same city and occasionally the same room with a mutual understanding that required no ongoing maintenance. And on the second Sunday of every month, Linda Carter came to have lunch with her son in the office above the main hall. Sitting across from him at his desk, drinking coffee, talking about nothing important and everything that mattered, in the quiet and ordinary way that people talk when they have built something together without ever quite planning to. The compass stayed in its case on the shelf. The ballroom stayed open. And the service corridors, the ones Jayden had known since he was 9 years old, sitting on a stool with a plate of food and a book while his mother worked the other side of the wall, were clean and bright and treated like they mattered. Because they did. And in this building, under this ownership, everyone who walked through any door, front entrance, or service corridor was going to be reminded of that. Do you believe that success is the best response to being underestimated? Or is there something even more powerful than success? Tell us in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe and stay with us, because the next story is already waiting.